Biker gangs were part of life in 1970s Britain. They modelled themselves on the Hells Angels of California. This psycho killer styled himself as a son of anarchy. He had the devil in him, and those who rode in his gang were on a highway to hell. Hello, and welcome to Psycho Killer, the podcast about Britain's worst criminals. I'm Simon Ford, a writer and journalist.
I'm Jack Morrell, a former major crime detective. My job may have been to investigate crimes and put criminals away, but I've always tried to understand what makes them tick.
And wearing our colours again, it's journalist and broadcaster Pip Watts.
Thanks, Simon. Let's kick up this hog and hit the road.
West Yorkshire is known for breeding tough characters. One of them was Paul-Anthony-Hobson, or Tony to his biker mates. Hobson was president of the West Riding chapter of the Hells Angels, based in Garforth, a town on the outskirts of Leeds. He was a colourful and charismatic character, admired by some local youths and feared by others. All of them knew not to cross Tony Hobson, because if you did, you disappeared.
Garforth was buzzing with speculation that Hobson was involved in the disappearances of two men. Chris Cooper was last seen alive on the 26th of July 1975. Phil Clapham, who was just 17, was last seen alive outside one of the bikers' pubs in Garforth on the 29th of July 1977. The local police suspected Hobson was involved, but there was no evidence and nobody brave or foolish enough to grass on Hobson. Tony Hobson cut a fearsome figure as he cruised the suburbs of Leeds, powerfully built, bearded and clad in denim and leather. He looked like the latter-day Saxon warrior. He had an aura about him. He seemed untouchable. Then, in 1981, the police found a reason to reach out and touch Tony Hobson. The disappearance of a third man came to light.
The third man was Dave Hurst. He was 20 and married with kids when he disappeared 3 days before Christmas in 1977. He was a Hells Angel and lived in the Seacroft area of Leeds, a few miles from Garforth. His wife hadn't reported him missing straight away because he was in the habit of going off on benders with his biker mates. These benders lasted for days. It was only when he failed to reappear on Christmas Day to see the kids open their presents that she realised something was up. And even then, it took the best part of 4 years for the police to follow up the missing person report. The local area commander Jeff Darley had his suspicions, but it took a dramatic turn of events for his superiors to take him seriously. Bob-Taylor retired from West Yorkshire Police as Detective Chief Superintendent. As a detective sergeant, he was assigned to the case.
Jeff Darley knew that Philip Clapham and Christopher Robin Cooper, that Hobson was the last one-ish to see them alive. But because David-Hirst had gone missing on the 22nd of December, the last working day before Christmas, and he just didn't come back to work after Christmas, and the report of him going missing was where he lived, which was in Leeds, so it wasn't in Garforth, the local sort of Garforth news. So we didn't know about that until a couple of years later, when there was a piece in the paper, whatever happened to David-Hirst. So then it's suddenly, we've got 3 people missing. I couldn't get anybody to sort of like take up his thoughts that, these guys have been murdered. But of course, after the Yorkshire Ripper, police started to have to look a little bit inwards at themselves and go, we need to actually look at this.
These days, we'd call that a lack of joined-up thinking, and social media would have flagged up the missing person case far sooner. Even so, It's incredible to think that these two communities, separated by just a few miles, could be so totally insulated from each other. And Jeff Darley, stumbling across an article in a local paper from down the road, I've never heard anything like it.
Could it be a coincidence that 3 men had gone missing from a small Yorkshire town over 2 years, and they were all linked in one way or another to Tony Hobson? Bob Taylor's team went in search of answers.
Everybody knew Tony Hobson in Garforth. They had a population of about 16,000, and him and Watson, his young mates, and Philip Clapham were, like Hells Angels. They wore the cut-off Hells Angels colours, mucky jeans, and he looked a bit like Charles Manson, did Tony Hobson. His hair was long, a bit straggly, and he did have a little bit of a presence about him. He was quite a powerfully built man, and he was president of the West Riding chapter of the Hells Angels. And the reason I laugh is because for a lot of the time, none of them had a motorbike, and they would strut round Garforth in their colours, going in the local pubs, getting drunk and carrying on. And of course, Hobson's about 26, Clapham's about 17. When he first met Watson, he was only 14. And they had been living a place called Garforth Cliff. Garforth Cliff is a caravan site, it's a residential caravan site. They had been living up there. And they all ended up working at this company, white-sea-and-baltic, which was just off the top of Main Street in Garforth.
Dave Hurst, Phil Clapham and Chris Cooper. Assuming Hobson had murdered them, he must have disposed of their bodies. So where were the bodies? A team of 6 detectives, led by Detective Sergeant Bob Taylor, approached the managing director of white-sea-and-baltic. They asked him to discreetly pick people who worked with Hobson for them to interview. It had to be done in absolute secrecy because of Hobson's reputation and the crimes of which he was suspected. Then, working in pairs, the detectives delved into each of the disappearances.
Disappearance number 1. Christopher Robin Cooper, age 37, married to Valerie, address Cypress Terrace, Garforth. A keen amateur photographer, Chris Cooper was a shortwave radio enthusiast and a member of a local gun club. He was anxious, immature for his age, and something of a gentle giant. He liked mixing with younger people and flirted with the Hells Angels. By coincidence, Cypress Terrace was round the corner from Tony Hobson's parents. Against Valerie's wishes, Cooper welcomed Hobson and the Hells Angels into their home. Chris Cooper was last seen alive at 1 p.m. on Saturday the 26th of July 1975, riding pillion on Hobson's motorbike. That evening, Valerie noticed his camera was missing. Assuming Chris was out taking photographs, she went to bed. In the small hours of Sunday morning, Valerie heard someone downstairs. She smelt gas. Someone had turned on the gas fire in the living room without lighting it. In the kitchen, all the rings on the electric stove were glowing red. The house could have blown up at any moment. Looking out of the window, Valerie saw Tony Hobson walking down Cypress Terrace. She told the police, "I turned everything off and thought no more about it." Odd, given that her life had been in danger moments before. But Chris and Valerie were an odd couple. Chris was an only child, and his parents doted on him. His disappearance was torture for them. In his memoirs, Bob Taylor recalls Chris's elderly mother pointing to a clock on their mantelpiece. "It stopped the day Christopher Robin went missing," she told the investigators, "and the day I wind it up again, will be the day he walks back through the door. The clock never ticked again.
Disappearance number 2. Philip Clapham, age 17, adopted by Thomas and Mary Clapham at the age of 6 months, suffered from asthma and diabetes, became uncontrollably aggressive at the age of 14 and was put into care. Address: Garforth Cliff Caravan Park. Unemployed after spending 3 months in a detention centre for stealing from his employer, Phil Clapham was exactly the kind of raw meat the Hells Angels fed on. The cult was his surrogate family. Tony Hobson was a father figure and the worst imaginable role model. In March 1977, Clapham moved into a caravan with Hobson and Andy Watson, a boy of just 15. Soon afterwards, Philip got a job at White-sea-and-Baltic. He started sleeping rough in a portable building that was used as a works canteen. He drank heavily, and this, combined with his diabetes treatment, turned him into a volatile and aggressive young man. Effectively a vagrant, Philip needed to visit his doctor for insulin. His last prescription was issued on the 15th of May 1977. That evening, Philip was seen drinking in Garforth with his Hells Angels cronies. By closing time, he was blind drunk and friends laid him out on a bench to sleep it off. His mother reported him missing on the 4th of August. Since Philip couldn't survive without insulin, the outlook was grim. However, that October, police linked Philip Clapham to a burglary. £30 in change was stolen along with an antique handgun. There was an unconfirmed sighting of him in November. Somehow, the teenager was still alive and in all probability armed.
Disappearance number 3. David Hirst, age 20. Address: Seacroft, Leeds. Married to Zena and a father of 2 children. Dave left for work at White-sea-and-Baltic on Thursday the 22nd of December 1977. His wife never saw him again. But at lunchtime, Dave was in the Gascoigne pub having a Christmas drink with Hobson and his other workmates, including a young lad, Andrew-Watson. Witnesses recalled that the 3 were the worst for drink and they were rowing. Dave Hurst failed to return to work after the holidays. Then a letter arrived. It asked for his employment papers to be sent home. It was signed D. Hurst. The office rubber-stamped it and posted Dave's documents to Zena. Luckily for the police, White-sea-and-Baltic had kept the letter, and the police were able to examine it. They compared it with a sample of Hobson's handwriting. Hobson was left-handed, Hurst right-handed, and it was obvious the letter was a forgery.
2 men and a teenage boy, missing, presumed murdered. Tony Hobson was the prime suspect, but he was protected by his associates in the Hells Angels. Anyone who broke ranks or grassed went straight onto his death list. However, Hobson's whereabouts around the time of the disappearances spoke volumes. He was off work for nearly 6 weeks with a broken hand. He busted in an accident the day Chris Cooper was last seen. Then there was the mystery of the buried motorcycle. One of Hobson's workmates asked the Hells Angel about a patch of disturbed earth at the back of the factory. Hobson shrugged it off. He said he'd buried a stolen motorbike there. Given his reputation, this was likely. Hobson's workmate, Stuart Jackson, was an older man. He wasn't intimidated by the Hells Angels and came forward to speak to the police. He told them he'd seen Hobson with firearms and that he kept one gun in his work locker. He'd seen Hobson plinking with the .22 caliber rifle in the field. This was the breakthrough the police needed. Stuart Jackson provided concrete evidence. Illegal gun ownership alone would have put Hobson in prison. And that patch of freshly disturbed earth behind the factory? Highly suspicious. Jackson said it was noticeable because there was snow on the ground. It had snowed heavily in the week before Christmas 1977. It also meant that if a body was buried there, it wasn't Philip Clapham. Most likely, it was Dave Hurst. Andrew Watson was only a kid, but he was in Hobson's thrall and probably doing his bidding. He was seen with Hobson and Clapham. He was seen with Hobson bullying David-Hirst at the Christmas party. He was Hobson's sidekick for sure. The two of them were in it together. But what was it? To prove Hobson was a murderer, the police needed at least one body.
The plan was simple. Stack pallets around the area where the motorbike was supposedly buried, and early on a Sunday morning, dig it up, if indeed it was a motorbike. Bob Taylor recalls how the ground was rock hard. The area had been flooded with turpentine. As the detectives hacked at the soil, it started giving off noxious fumes. Eventually, they gave up, covered their tracks, and ordered a mechanical digger. At first light, on Tuesday the 25th of August 1981, the digger got to work. Simultaneously, a team of officers arrived at Hobson's house to give him the famous 6 o'clock knock. Bob Taylor recalls that Hobson, half dressed and half asleep, showed no emotion as he welcomed them into his home. Taylor told him he was under arrest for the murder of David Hurst. "Come on, lads, give over. You're not serious," Hobson replied. They were. Deadly serious. Hobson was taken in for questioning, while a search team pulled his house apart.
Hobson denied being involved in David Hirst's disappearance and brushed off the suggestion he'd murdered his workmate. "Come on, lads, murder, that's not me," he said. It was simple. They'd been for a Christmas drink. They then nipped back to the canteen for a spliff before Dave caught the train around 4. And he denied he and Andrew Watson had been arguing with the missing man outside the pub. Then the police showed Hobson the forged letter. He denied writing it and denied he wrote the letter to create a false trail. But the interview was far from over. Jeff Darley showed Hobson his handwriting sample. It was on a safety and security report. "Look at this," said Darley. "It's the same writing." And so it was. There were pages and pages of it. "So that's why I did that report," muttered Hobson. "Took me 2 bloody weeks." After a short break, the suspect was now ready to talk. And talk he did. He confessed to all 3 murders.
So what had Dave Hurst done to wind up on Hobson's hit list? Well, as Hobson explained in his confession, Hurst's capital offence was to call the president of the West Riding Hells Angels a wanker. So Hobson led him round the back of the factory after the Christmas booze-up, stuck a gun in his ear and pulled the trigger.
Bastard!
It was a small caliber round, and Hurst didn't die immediately. Hobson and the boy Watson buried the corpse. 4 years later, when they recovered his body, that bullet was still there, rattling around inside Dave Hurst's skull.
Chris Cooper was accused of messing with Hobson's girlfriend, Elaine Thompson. This was a capital offence, according to the law of the Hells Angels. Hobson admitted luring Cooper to Parlington Woods on the pretext of showing him some guns. But the Hells Angel boss made a prior visit. He'd already dug Cooper's grave, disguised it with branches, and hidden a spade nearby.
Fucking hit him!
Cooper might have been a mummy's boy, but he was a big lad and fought hard. He almost got the better of Hobson. It was a good job his schoolboy sidekick, Andrew Watson, was waiting in the wings. Hobson was on top of Cooper. Watson grabbed the spade. Hobson put his hand on Cooper's head and yelled, "Fucking hit him!" Watson did as he was told and smashed Hobson's hand. The second blow hit its target. When pathologists examined Chris Cooper's remains, they found his skull was split from front to back like a walnut. Watson stuffed Cooper into the hole. It was too small and the corpse ended up in a sitting position. Nursing his broken hand, Hobson stamped down the dirt, lit a cigarette and took himself off to hospital. The injury explained his extended absence from work. He used Chris Cooper's keys to burgle his house, which explained the missing camera equipment, but he denied turning on the gas fire and the stove.
Young Phil Clapham was a liability and he had to die. He was living rough, smoking dope and drinking himself into oblivion. His savage temper was his undoing. Ironically, for a cult that attracted juvenile delinquents, Clapham's behaviour was excessive. Hobson and Watson rescued Clapham from yet another bar brawl and took him back to the temporary canteen building where he was dossing. Hobson said he was kicking Clapham out of the Hells Angels and demanded his jacket. Clapham flew into a rage. Hobson and Watson set about the teenager with a hammer and an iron bar. Watson went berserk. He should have been in high school, but he pulverised Clapham's head. Hobson confessed. There was blood and bone all over. We took half his fucking head off. Satisfied Clapham was no longer a threat to the honour of the Hells Angels, Hobson and Watson dug a 7-foot deep grave. They scooped up the remains of Clapham's head and stuffed them into his sleeping bag along with his body. Then they dragged the bundle to the hole with Watson retching the whole way. It felt like half of Garforth was watching, said Hobson, but nobody noticed. The pair were back in the boozer for last orders. As the interview ended, Hobson leant forward. I'm not a nutter, he said. Some people have God, I only have the Hells Angels. It's the nearest thing to religion. If my time came around again, I'd do it to anyone else who crossed me. By putting those words on the record, Hobson sealed his fate.
What is it, Jack, that compels an offender to tell all, like Tony Hobson did, even if they know it means they're going to spend, potentially, the rest of their life in prison?
I think it's relieving a burden. Hobson had been carrying around the knowledge of what he'd done for 4 years. He was a hard man, but he couldn't control the psychological trauma. He said he'd never forget Dave Hirst's expression when he shot him in the head, or his last word, bastard. And even Hobson was shocked by the frenzy with which Andrew Watson battered Phil Clapham to death, his head disintegrating and bits of brain and bone flying everywhere. A few months prior, the three of them had been living in the same caravan, for goodness sake. Clapham looked up to Hobson, if not as a father, then like an older brother. And there he was with his skull in bits and his brain turned to pulp. The picture must have haunted Hobson. I'd say he probably suffered flashbacks to that snowy Thursday afternoon in December 1977. And here's another thing. Hobson would have been gnawed at by the thought that Watson could just as easily turn on him. You know, his protege could flip and smash his head in two. I mean, he'd underestimated Chris Cooper. If Hobson hadn't managed to grab the spade, it might have been him in that hole. He realised he wasn't invincible, and he also knew he'd spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for that 6 o'clock knock, and the SWAT team dragging him barefoot from his warm bed to a clap-cold cell. The moment Hobson realised he was banged to rights, all that lifted from his shoulders. I've seen it myself, you know. A suspect knows the game's up. They tell you everything. Sometimes they're quite matter-of-fact about it. Sometimes they're emotional. But either way, getting it off their chest, as we say, frees them from the secrets and lies. Physically, they're in captivity. Mentally, they've been released. It's a weird trade-off, but suspects often jump at the chance, just like Tony Hobson did. There was something else too. Hobson's girlfriend, Elaine Thompson, died in a crash a few months prior. Her loss had brought Hobson to his senses. For the first time in his life, he'd felt remorse. Finally, there was his loyalty to Andy Watson, as Bob Taylor recalls.
Watson had been brought in, and Watson had absolutely gone to pieces, screaming and crying. And I think, because when he said this, and leave lad alone, well, nobody was doing anything to the lad. The realisation had suddenly hit Watson that his wife was pregnant. He might not see his wife, he might not see his child again as a free man for a long time. But Hobson had interpreted that into the fact that we might be torturing him. So, he did have feelings for Watson. So he said, leave the young lad alone, you're talking about 3. And he admitted the 3.
At their trial, Watson had to be supported by 2 prison officers. The judge, Justice Kenneth Jones, told him he'd be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure.
Then the judge turned to Hobson and said, "These were horrifying murders, horrifying for their brutality and horrifying for the deliberation which you brought to the killings of at least 2 of these young men. You say you've made a religion of evil. Many misguided young people also belong to this abominably evil cult called the Hells Angels. But you are to be marked off because you have shown yourself to have the capacity to kill not 1, but 3 human beings in cold blood. I have no doubt you are a ruthless killer." He sentenced Hobson to life in prison with a recommendation that he serve at least 30 years.
A little later, Hobson helped clear up the mysterious death of James Woodhead, a war veteran who had the misfortune to be the grandfather of Elaine Thompson, Hobson's girlfriend. Woodhead suspected Hobson was stealing from him.
Well, of course, he was stealing from him.
He wanted his granddaughter to dump her dodgy boyfriend, so one evening, Hobson rode over to have a word with the old man. Mr. Woodhead had fought the Nazis. He wasn't going to let some greasy punk get the better of him. He landed a couple of good punches, but then his heart burst. In a panic, Hobson put the body in the bath and locked the door behind him. He was serving his sentence in Winson Green Prison, and, having nothing to lose, he came clean.
Tony Hobson died in prison of cancer. Staff said he was a model prisoner. A curious end to the curious case of the psycho biker killer Tony Hobson. Bob Taylor says it reminds him of the old fable of the scorpion and the frog.
The scorpion wanted to cross the river. He asked the frog to carry him over on his back. "No," said the frog, "you will sting me and I will die." "I promise you I won't," said the scorpion. "Okay," said the frog, and he let the scorpion jump onto his back. In the middle of the river, where it was deepest and fastest flowing, the scorpion stung the frog. As the frog rolled over dying, he looked up at the scorpion and said, "Why did you do that? We will both die now." The scorpion said, "I'm sorry, but I couldn't help myself. It's in my nature, you see."
An appetite for destruction, or at least self-destruction, you might say.
Finally, there are indeed 2 sides to every story. Were the Hells Angels an evil cult? Well, if you were a British judge 40 years ago, it might have seemed that way. All he knew about the Angels was what he'd heard in court and read in the Daily Telegraph over his boiled egg and soldiers. You don't hear much about the Hells Angels in Britain these days, but they're still out there, putting on charity rides and promoting motorcycle safety.
Hobson wasn't representative. The Hells Angels were a lightning rod for his damaged personality. You might argue that, if anything, Tony Hobson tarnished the reputation of the Hells Angels.
Now there's a thought. Andrew Watson was another model prisoner. He did his time, he came out, started a new life, and he hasn't been heard of since. Our thanks to retired DCS-Bob-Taylor for his help making this episode. Now it's goodbye from me, from Pip, and from Jack. We'll see you again soon on the dark side for another psycho killer, shocking British true crime story.